All right, good evening, everyone. It is 6 o'clock. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Leslie Scardin, and I'm on the board of the League of Women Voters of the Charleston area, and also our Director of Good Government and Ethics. A few housekeeping items before we get started. One, please stay on mute throughout the event. You'll be automatically muted when you come in, but please stay on mute. Two, please go ahead and turn off your video to focus on the panelists. We will have an opportunity for a Q&A at the end, and questions will be accepted via the chat. So feel free to send your questions to the host via chat, and we'll have some time for that at the end of the event. We are live streaming on Facebook for anyone who's having trouble with the link. If they're not on now, you can direct them to our Facebook page, the League of Women Voters of the Charleston area. And we'll also be posting a recording of this on our Facebook page when this is over. So welcome to our third session on good government. We hope you've had a chance to join some of our previous sessions, but if not, welcome. We're glad to have you. We want to give a quick shout out to our collaborators. Of course, the League of Women Voters of South Carolina and many of our local chapters, Clemson, Columbia, Florence, Greenville, Hilton Head, Spartanburg. Thanks for joining us. The College of Charleston Political Science Department is represented tonight as well through one of our speakers. Our other collaborators are Women in Leadership, the Berkeley Chamber of Commerce, the Legal Defense Fund, the ACLU of South Carolina, the South Carolina Commission for Minority Affairs, and also the Interfaith Power and Light and Sustaining Way. So thank you so much to our collaborators. And of course, thank you to our amazing league members who have been so pivotal to this series: Barbara Griffin, Barbara Zia, Shana Howe, Sarah, Kirsten, Leah, and many others. Thank you for joining us and being here and supporting us. So just a quick overview of this series. This is a nonpartisan series to promote education and awareness relating to these critical good government issues that impact everything across our national, state, and local levels. We've had our 2 sessions already on voting rights and redistricting. If you missed those, you can find those recordings on our Facebook page, the League of Women Voters of the Charleston area. Each of these events comes with corresponding pre-reads and a call to action. So we'll talk about our call to action at the end of this event. So we're not just learning, but also taking steps towards change. A quick flag that our next and 4th event, Money in Politics, is scheduled for May 10th. If you want to sign up for alerts about those events, please go to our website, the League of Women Voters of the Charleston area, and sign up for our newsletter. So before we introduce our wonderful panelists tonight, just wanted to give a bit of background on this session. This focuses on another set of very timely topics that come with a complicated history, but are greatly impactful for the future of our democracy. So this evening, we'll hear more about the history of the Electoral College, the US Senate, the filibuster, how they function today, and we'll also spend some time learning about the National Popular Vote Compact. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have Jordan Ragusa from the College of Charleston, and then also Kathleen Crampton, who will be talking to us about the National Popular Vote. So I'll introduce Kathleen a little later, but to have a brief bio on Dr. Ragusa. He is an associate professor and associate chair of political science at the College of Charleston. His research focuses on the US Congress with specific interests on the effects of political parties, polarization, and legislative organizations and the policymaking process. He's published work on the presidency, congressional and presidential elections, political behavior, and political economy. And he has 2 wonderful books out. The first is Congress in Reverse: Repeals from Reconstruction to the Present. And the second is First in the South: Why the South Carolina Presidential Primary Matters. Dr. Ragusa is also the co-director of the college's American Politics Research Team and a research fellow in the Center for Public Choice and Market Process. So I'm going to stop screen sharing, and Jordan's going to pull up his presentation, and we're going to turn it over to Jordan.
I always forget if I'm unmuted or not. You would think after having so much time on Zoom, I would remember to do that. Well, thank you, Leslie, for that introduction. And thank you to all the organizers for the invitation. I have tremendous respect for the league and the work that it does. A few years back, I wanted my students to do a voter registration drive on campus. And I quickly realized I had no idea how to accomplish that. And so I reached out to the league and they put me in touch with someone who not only educated me, but came and talked to my students. And so this really is an honor. I mentioned to Leslie that, there are two types of presentations, those that say a lot about a little and those that say a little about a lot. Mine's going to be the latter. I'm going to try to tell you as much as I can about the history of the Electoral College and the history of the filibuster in 40 minutes. Of course, entire classes are taught on these topics. So really, I'm just going to scratch the surface. I welcome your questions during Q&A. So I want to start. I organized my remarks based on four seemingly simple questions, although I think one of the points that I want to make is that they are not actually that simple. Why do we have an electoral college? Why does it matter today? Why do we have a filibuster? And why does the filibuster matter today? So on the first, why do we have an electoral college? Well, this is kind of a complicated conversation. It's one that's inevitably very political. And the reason why it's political is that there are liberal and conservative interpretations on what we call the framers' intentions. Why did they do what they did? On the left, we have a progressive view that's often attributed to progressive historians at the turn of the century, in particular a historian named Charles Beard, who primarily argued that the framers were a cohesive group of economic elites who were primarily trying to protect their wealth and privilege. So if we look at things like the Fifth Amendment's protection on private property, or just more generally, the fact that it's difficult for citizens to get their policy demands enacted into law. Well, what was motivating the framers? Well, protecting, again, their wealth and privilege. On the right, the conservative view is that the framers were a cohesive group of wise thinkers that had principles about good governance that they were simply trying to put into practice. Robert Bork is a famous champion of this view. We have ideas like originalism and textualism, which tell us that we simply need to look to the framers' motivations and the plain wording of the Constitution to understand what they had in mind. Most political scientists and historians embrace kind of a centrist view that elements of both of these are right, and we call this pluralism. The idea here is that the framers were a diverse group of individuals with varied interests and principles. So we, of course, don't mean that they were diverse demographically. They weren't. But they had lots of interests and principles. They encompassed federalists and anti-federalists. They encompassed farmers and merchants and bankers. They, of course, represented large and small states, and they represented northern and southern states. And so out of this mix, the Constitution should be understood as a complex set of compromises. And so to understand the Constitution, we need to understand what those compromises were. So in the context of the Electoral College, what I thought I'd do is share the thinking of three founding fathers and what they thought about the best way to elect the President of the United States. So the first one is this gentleman, kind of an important figure. This is James Madison. James Madison is, of course, the so-called father of the Constitution. And he, was one of the people that thought we should scrap the Articles of Confederation and start over. And so he got to the Constitution Convention early, and he drafted what we now just call the Virginia Plan, which was the large state plan. And what Madison said in the Virginia Plan about electing the president was this: resolved that a national executive be instituted. So that might seem kind of simple, but remember, the Articles of Confederation did not have an executive branch, just a unicameral Congress. And that national executive should be chosen by the national legislature. That's kind of a foreign idea to us in the United States, but it really wasn't that weird of an idea in that time period. Not only did the Virginia Plan say that Congress should choose the president, but the rival plan, the New Jersey Plan, which was a small state plan, also said that Congress should choose the president. Most state legislatures chose governors in this time period. And of course, most advanced democracies actually choose their executives in this way. Of course, Congress does not choose the president, so we have to look elsewhere. The second founding father that I want to focus on is the same person. It's James Madison. This is not a mistake on your screen. He had this to say during the debates in the Constitution Convention. He said, quote, "The people at large are fittest to elect the president and would choose a president of distinguished character." So of course, Madison's saying the exact opposite of what he originally introduced, but most historians think that this was his main principle. Madison says specifically that, electing the president by something akin to a popular vote would be bad for the state of Virginia, but I think it's the wisest way to go about things. After he left the presidency, he said he favored something akin to a national popular vote. Of course, we don't elect presidents by national popular vote either, so we have to look elsewhere. And if you can figure out the pattern, it's going to be another James Madison quote. Later on in the debates, he says something that's really key, that tells us a lot about why we ultimately have an electoral college. And he says this, a limitation with the popular vote is, quote, that suffrage is more diffusive in the northern than the southern states, and the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of the Negroes. And what Madison is saying in the first part is that the right to vote was much more prevalent in the northern states, in particular in Pennsylvania. All states restricted the right to vote severely by our contemporary standards, but it was much more widespread in many of the northern states. And so if we had a national popular vote, of course, the northern states would have more votes to contribute. But the second part is really key. At this point in the Constitutional Convention, the 3/5 clause had already been inserted into the House of Representatives. The Southern delegates demanded that as a marker for their support for the Constitution. And so Madison's saying that if we go with the popular vote or something else, the Southern states are not going to have the same disproportionate power that they do in the House. So what's the solution? Well, it's the Electoral College that we currently have. The formula for the Electoral College is, of course, a state's representatives plus the 3/5 clause, so 3/5 of those enslaved, plus their senators, which is, of course, 2 per state, and then the 23rd Amendment later adds 3 for the District of Columbia. So that's 538 in our modern time period. This was a significant giveaway to the Southern states. The Southern states really did earn a massive concession in the Electoral College. To kind of put it into perspective, after the 1790 census, which was the first census conducted in the United States, Virginia had 10% fewer white citizens than Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was the largest state if we went simply based on its free white citizens. But Virginia got 20% more votes in the Electoral College. That is a massive swing from one large state to the other. The result is ultimately that prior to the Civil War, 70% of our presidents, that's 14 of 20, were from former Confederate states. And I think it was 3 of the 6 were all after 1840 that were from the North. So the Electoral College really needs to be understood in context. There are common arguments about federalism, that it was protecting the small states from the large states. That's kind of a misreading of the history. Madison himself says there's nothing that really kind of ties Virginia and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts together. These are very different states with different religious traditions, cultural backgrounds, and economic modalities. Just because we're large states, we're not bound together. There are other arguments about, protecting us from unwise decisions by citizens. But that's not a common argument during the Constitutional Convention. Really, it boils down to the fact that the Southern states would not go along with any of the other schemes for electing the president, absent something that gave them the same power that they had in the House of Representatives. Why does it matter today? Well, I want to share a map and two figures with you. And so the map that you're looking at is the dates of admission of states. And so if you sort of start, I don't know, in Ohio and kind of move west and north, you can see kind of a regular 10 to 15 year gap between when new states are added into the Union. So Ohio's 1803, Indiana's 1816, Illinois 1818, Wisconsin 1848, Minnesota 1858. But notice what happens when we go into the Dakotas. South Dakota, November 2nd, 1889. North Dakota, November 2nd, 1889. Montana, November 8th, 1889. Washington, November 11th, 1889. In a little over a week, 4 brand new states were added into the Union. Going down then into Idaho. So Idaho is admitted July 3rd, 1890, and Wyoming then is admitted July 10th, 1890. So these are 6 very rural states that are all admitted in less than 6 months of one another. What's going on here? Well, you have to remember that the 14th Amendment tried to walk a fine line. On the one hand, the 14th Amendment via the 15th Amendment is going to give Southern states expanded power. It's going to give it even greater representation than what it had prior to the Civil War. Former enslaved Africans are now going to count as whole persons as the basis of representation in the House, and by extension in the Electoral College. So there's a potential danger there that the framers of the 14th Amendment recognized. They also inserted something called the penalty clause into the 14th Amendment, which basically said that if a state denies its citizens the right to vote, their representation in the House, and then of course by extension the Electoral College, can be reduced proportionally. The problem is that a series of efforts to enforce the penalty clause in the 14th Amendment were filibustered in the Senate or never gained traction. So what you have is what a lot of historians call the Southern bonus. The Southern states were advantaged significantly by the 14th Amendment, but they didn't have to guarantee African Americans the right to vote. So what do Republicans do? Well, they have one last option, and it's something that maybe sounds familiar today: admit new states. I dug up the quote from a member of the Senate, and this is Wisconsin Senator John Spooner. He's talking about, why did we split the Dakota territories into 2 states? And he says, quote, "The first gun was fired by South Carolina and gave slavery its death wound. But the relative position of the parties today is not changed with the disappearance of the institution." So splitting the Dakotas had nothing to do with geography or population. It was simply an attempt by Republican lawmakers to counterbalance what was going on in the Southern states. So this is, of course, a notable goal. Oh, they're zooming in on the dates if you don't believe me. This is, of course, a notable goal, but it has an important legacy today. This is a figure from The Nation, and what this figure shows is the amount of over and under representation in the Electoral College by state in both 1804, so that's going to be after the second census, and in 2015, that's going to be after the most recent completed census. And what's key here is, and I don't know how big this is on your screen, but the 1 line, so if you look down at the bottom on the x-axis, there's a vertical line at 1. 1 would be the position of perfect representation. In other words, the state is represented in the Electoral College in proportion to its population. Anything to the right indicates overrepresentation. The state is more powerful in the Electoral College than its population would suggest. Anything to the left of 1 would indicate underrepresentation. So let's look at a couple key things. In 1804, Ohio was the most overrepresented state. It was admitted in 1803, so it's still a small state in this time period. It's roughly a 2 on this scale. What that means is that Ohio was 2 times more powerful in this era in the Electoral College than its population would suggest. Compare that to what exists today. The most overrepresented state today is Wyoming, and that was one of the states that Republicans admitted into the Union in an effort to combat the quote unquote Southern bonus. Wyoming is 3 times more overrepresented than its population would suggest. There are 7 states today that are more overrepresented in the Electoral College than Ohio was back in 1804. The rural state bias has been exacerbated by the admission of those states back in the late 1800s. The second figure comes from an important article that a lot of my comments are drawing on. It's by William Blake at the University of Maryland. And what he wanted to know is, even though, the Civil War is, of course, over, slavery no longer exists, does the Electoral College still have a racial bias in it? And so what he looks at is each state's racial resentment index, basically public opinion data on a variety of race-related measures, and how much over or under representation is there in that state. So higher values on the y-axis, more over representation, lower values, under representation, figures to the right, greater racial resentment, figures to the left, less racial resentment. And what he shows quite clearly, there's a strong connection between a state's disproportionate power in the Electoral College today and its racial resentment index. So in other words, even though ostensibly race is no longer a part of the Electoral College, these key decisions that happened in the 1800s still magnify the effect of race and racial conflict. Okay, so moving on to the filibuster, I want to talk a little bit about the origins of the filibuster. Because like the Electoral College, there is some confusion about where the filibuster came from. A common argument that a lot of people make is that, well, it's in the Constitution, right? No, it's not in the Constitution. If you look for the word filibuster in the Constitution, you won't find it. What you will find is Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2, which says plainly, each house may determine its own rules. In other words, whatever the House wants for its rules is constitutional, and whatever the Senate wants for its rules is constitutional. So the filibuster is not in the Constitution. A second common argument is that, well, okay, maybe it's not in the Constitution, but it was created in the first Congress. And this is sort of like what happened with the Bill of Rights. That, in other words, the Bill of Rights wasn't in the original Constitution, but everyone sort of understood that it would be added to the rule book of the House and Senate down the road. This is also not true. And if you take a quick glance at the rule books of both the House and Senate in the first Congress, they were nearly identical, and both had ways of cutting off debate. So the question then is, all right, where did the filibuster come from? And it has to do with this individual. This individual is not James Madison. In fact, this is not a founding father. This is Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr was the 3rd vice president of the United States under Thomas Jefferson. And as vice president, that makes him president of the Senate. When he was presiding over the Senate shortly after shooting Alexander Hamilton, he looked at the rule book and he said, we have this thing called a previous question motion, but we've almost never used it. And it's sort of unbecoming of such a grand institution that we have an untidy rule book. And so he suggested getting rid of the previous question, which makes it possible to end debate. So this may seem like just kind of a cute little story, but note what's key here. Burr was not saying, get rid of the previous question, allow unlimited debate because it would protect minority rights or foster greater deliberation. He was simply saying, get rid of it because it hasn't been used. Once the previous question motion is gone, subsequent majorities have no tool available to them to cut off debate. In this time period, that wasn't a big deal, though. There were only 17 states in this time period. So that means there were 34 senators. So it was a small institution. There was a tiny national agenda. The Congress did not have to deal with the pressing national issues that Congress had to deal with in the late 1800s, or certainly not today. And there was low partisan conflict. Ostensibly, there was only one political party in this time period, the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. And so it just wasn't a big deal if members of the Senate wanted to debate endlessly. Here's the data from a book on the filibuster by Gregory Koger. He's written the definitive academic book on the filibuster. Notice what happens. After 1805, when the previous question motion is jettisoned from the Senate rulebook, filibusters don't start happening. In fact, it's many decades before filibusters became very common. John C. Calhoun had a reputation for using the filibuster to stymie civil rights and anti-slavery related legislation. But it's really the 1800s where filibusters become most prominent in the Senate. And the 1800s are important for a variety of reasons. One is it's a period of intense party conflict and polarization, where control of the House, the Senate, and the White House flipped back and forth in rapid succession. It's also a time period where members of the Senate were dealing with a range of pressing national issues, including civil rights legislation. That sounds a lot like our contemporary Senate. There are a lot of features in common with the late 1800 Senate and the contemporary Senate, other than just the filibuster. The modern filibuster looks a little different than it did in the 1800s, however, and in fact, the modern filibuster looks a lot different than it did in the 1950s and 1960s. One of the key moments is in 1917. So in 1917, on the verge of the U.S. entry into World War I, Woodrow Wilson is trying to get legislation through Congress to arm merchant ships, and anti-war progressives are blocking that effort via filibuster. And so Wilson and his Democratic allies pushed through something called Rule 22. And Rule 22, for the first time, undoes what Aaron Burr did, which is to create a mechanism to end debate. We call that cloture. And the cloture requirement was 2/3 of those, quote, present and voting. That language is important. Present and voting means that the minority party has to be on the floor to maintain the filibuster. The onus is on the minority, and 67 votes are needed to end debate. In the 1970s, there are a range of reforms that are adopted to both the House and the Senate. Some of those have to do with Watergate. Others of those have to do with the range of filibusters on civil rights legislation by Southern Democrats that upset their more liberal colleagues in the New England states. And so two of those reforms developed what we call the two-track system. And this is how the filibuster works today. The first part of this reform was to reduce the threshold down to 3/5 of those duly chosen and sworn. So on the one hand, it's reducing it to only 60 votes, but the language duly chosen and sworn means that now the onus is on the majority. They have to marshal 60 votes to cut off debate, rather than the minority party having to maintain the floor to keep 2/3 of members present to cut off debate. And two, the two-track system literally works where the Senate can consider two bills at one time. What that means is that if Bill A is being filibustered, the Senate can quickly move on to Bill B. These two things combine to make filibusters in the modern Congress costless. It is very easy to filibuster legislation because of these two reforms. They make sense, but it's not hard for the minority party to filibuster. Literally, they just say, I will filibuster if this bill comes to the floor, and that essentially blocks legislation. More recently, there were two changes to the filibuster on presidential nominees. In 2013, Harry Reid went, quote, nuclear, and ended the filibuster on nominations below the Supreme Court. And in 2017, Republicans did the same thing. They went nuclear again and got rid of the filibuster on Supreme Court nominees. This is how Donald Trump got Neil Gorsuch onto the Supreme Court. So that's where the filibuster came from. Why does it matter today? Here, I just have one chart that I want to show you. And this chart reveals one thing that I think is sort of obvious to most of us, but also one thing that's not obvious. What we're looking at in this chart is the frequency of cloture votes and efforts that succeeded to invoke cloture from 1917, when Rule 22 is adopted, all the way to the present. So the black line is going to be there was a vote on cloture, and the dashed line is going to be cloture was successfully invoked. In other words, the filibuster failed. So the obvious thing that we see is that over time, there has been an absolute explosion in filibusters in the modern Congress. There were some in the 50s and 60s. Of course, those are on the Civil Rights Act of 57, 60, 64, and related measures. There's some in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. But Obama's presidency, the 111th Congress, beginning of the 111th Congress, that's when things really escalate. Of course, Democrats returned the favor during Donald Trump's 4 years in office. And there really has been an explosion in the use of filibusters in the modern Senate. And as you would expect, it really is the reason why major legislation dies. But the other thing that's not obvious, and this is where I'll end, has to do with the gap between cloture votes and those that are ultimately successful. In the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, we can see a healthy gap between cloture votes and those that ultimately succeed. What this means is that a lot of filibusters in this time period succeeded, at least as a proportion. A lot of them succeeded in blocking action on a bill. If I zoom into the modern Senate, the past couple decades, what we see is that the gap between these two has narrowed. That may seem like good news. In other words, filibusters are happening at a high rate, but they're often being defeated. So this is good news, right? No, not really. The reason why so many of these cloture votes are succeeding in breaking a filibuster is that the minority party is filibustering just about everything. There are 30 hours of debate even once cloture is invoked. And that is a really major time crunch on the US Senate. It is not uncommon for a bill or a nominee to come to the floor of the Senate, for a filibuster to be waged, cloture to be invoked, and then the bill or motion passes with 90, 95, or even 100 senators in support. In other words, why is the minority filibustering? Is it to extend debate? Is it try to extract concessions? No, they are really trying to gum up the works and prevent the majority from being able to do just about anything. And so hopefully that was 40 minutes or under. That's a brief history of these two institutions. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Jordan, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I want to come to one of your classes now at the College of Charleston and take a whole semester on this. So thank you. That was great. And I see some questions coming in. Again, we'll do a Q&A at the end, but please go ahead and send your questions in the chat to the host, and we'll grab those at the end. So I'm going to switch back my screen and introduce Kathleen. So Kathleen is our second speaker for this evening. She is with the League of Women Voters in Florida and is the chair of the Floridians for the National Popular Vote. So we'll learn a lot about that coming up. In addition to her advocacy, Kathleen is a senior executive with experience across the healthcare sector. So from 2009 to 2014, she was the president and CEO for United Healthcare of Florida, Inc. Community Plan, which is one of the largest providers of managed care services to the Medicaid population in Florida. So Kathleen is an expert in many, many things, and we're very grateful that she has joined us this evening to educate us on the National Popular Vote Compact. I'm going to control the slides from here. So Kathleen, just tell me when you want to hit next.
Okay, well, first of all, can you hear me? I trust you can.
Yes, can hear you.
Okay, good. First of all, I want to say thank you to Leslie and to Barb Zia and Barb Griffin and for all the folks for inviting me. And also to congratulate you on what I believe to be a truly impressive program. Everything about it is just first rate, and I assure you I have forwarded it on to some of our colleagues here in Florida to say, you know, this is how a program ought to be run. So congratulations to you all. I also just want to say to Dr. Ragusa, I have not heard as good an explanation on how the Electoral College sort of came about and why and how the 3/5 was done. High marks to you, and I've heard a lot of people try to explain that. So thank you very, very much for that. But I first learned about National Popular Vote when I attended, yes, a League of Women Voters biannual convention 4 years ago. I'd always thought that the Electoral College was a little bit like the appendix, useful but out of date. And what I learned at that meeting was, yes, there was a way for states to change their own rules, and by doing so, change how the Electoral College functions. And hence, I became a huge fan of National Popular Vote and began to understand how it would really improve the overall effectiveness of our democracy. And let me also just say that Dr. Ragusa's, his last slide, I have the same slide, but in a totally different presentation. So you'll see some of the same sorts of things. Lots of fun here when things come together, and actually we didn't talk prior to this. So let's go to the next slide. You know, when you go to elect the president, most people go as Americans. However, if you look carefully, they really actually go as residents of a state. They just don't think that way. Next slide. So this is a version of the slide that Dr. Ragusa showed us, and you can see here that each of the states has an electoral number. And if you look at South Carolina, let me see if can you see me moving the 9 here? Total of 538 electoral votes from 50 states in the District of Columbia. Next slide. And so what does the Constitution say about the Electoral College? And this, yes, for the most part, is it. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. Now, there were a number of ways that people actually originally elected people. And I'm not going to go into all that detail because I really don't have enough time. But I'm sure Dr. Ragusa and I can also comment on all of the variations of that theme. But let's talk first about what some of the problems are with what we've got currently. Next slide, please. First of all, the candidate with the most votes may not win. I'm going to talk more about that. Votes, as Dr. Ragusa pointed out, are not equal from one state to another. Most states are passed over in campaigns, and they become what are called spectator states. And one of the results of that is voter apathy. So let's go to the next slide, please. So here we go. Here are the 5 times where the candidate who gets the most votes actually does not become our president. The first was in 1824, John Quincy over Andrew Jackson. In 1876, Rutherford Hayes over Tilden. 1888, Benjamin Harris over Grover Cleveland. And then twice in the last 2 decades, George Bush over Al Gore, and yes, Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. Probably does not work to have a minority president, and even yes, Donald Trump would agree to that. Next slide. This is another presentation of the point that Dr. Ragusa was making. So let's take a look at this. If you look on the left, you'll see that there is a total population of about 8 million for all of these states. Wyoming, Vermont, North Dakota, Rhode Island, some of the same ones that were in the top of his slide. And they have a total of 29 electoral votes. If you look at Florida, where I come from, we have about 21 million people. And yes, we have 29 electoral votes. What it means is that if you take a state like Wyoming, which has 550,000 voters, with their 3 electoral votes, each of those voters represents about 175,000 voters. But if you look in Florida, you're going to see that each of the electoral voters represents about 780,000 voters. So it means that there's a huge, the balance of power really falls to those states that are smaller. And you'll also know that some of them are blue and some of them are red. Next slide. I also mentioned that that many states become what are called spectator states. And all of the spectator states here are states that have no numbers, because what those numbers represent are all of the campaign events in 2016 after the primaries were held and after the conventions. And you'll see that 2/3 of the events were in just 6 states: Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan. So you can see that there were many states, of which South Carolina was one, where there wasn't one visit. Let's jump to the next slide, please, and to what happened in 2020. Now, you'll recall there weren't as many visits because of our friend COVID-19, but you see exactly the same thing. 12 states received 96% of the electoral campaign events. And the big states were, yes, the same ones, Pennsylvania, although not Virginia, because Virginia has become really a reliably blue state, North Carolina, Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan, some of the same states that we've seen where all the action really took place in 2020. Next slide, please. And so these states are ignored. Vermont, Texas, California, West Virginia. It doesn't make any difference whether they're big or small. Next slide, please. It's the battleground states that determine who becomes president. The campaigns woo battleground states. They ignore 70% of the US voters. And the result, among other things, is voter apathy. Next slide. This shows you the turnout comparison between battleground states and spectator states. So in battleground states, the turnout among voters, registered voters, is about 67%, whereas in spectator states, it's way down around 60%. So what is the issue here? Next slide, please. It is a problem about how the states actually choose their electors. In the mid-1800s, almost all, but not all, almost all, and I'll make a comment about that in a minute, passed something called winner-take-all laws. 48 states plus the District of Columbia passed these. And what this says is that all of a state's electoral votes are awarded to the candidate with the most states in that state, regardless of the margin. So for example, let's take a state that has 10,000 voters. And if the candidate who gets 5,001 votes gets all of the state's electoral votes, and the candidate who got 4,999 votes gets nothing. So what it does is it leverages for the winner all of the state's electoral votes. And there's a very interesting history which we can talk about, and I'm sure Dr. Ragosa knows more than I do about it, but it all has to do with Thomas Jefferson, and we can come back to that if you're interested in it. So how should we elect? If you went out, next slide, please. If you went out and you asked the man on the street who's interested in votes, they would say it should be one person, one vote. So how do we get there? Next slide, please. Well, we can't amend the Constitution and abolish the Electoral College. Now, it is possible to do that, and the last time that it was done at all with any effectiveness was in 1970, when the effort to abolish the Electoral College was passed in the House. But yes, because of something called the filibuster, it was not passed in the Senate. And thus, the last time that there was any really a viable effort to get rid of the Electoral College went down to defeat. What's the another alternative? Oh, let me just say, I believe that there have been 700 efforts to try and abolish the Electoral College. Meanwhile, there is a way to maintain the Electoral College, but improve the current system. It would mean that you stop using winner take all. And yes, remember I said this is something that the states passed. This is not in the Constitution. You'll hear more about that in a minute. It would guarantee the winner to the individual who gets the most votes nationwide. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And it ensures that every vote is equal. Next slide, please. How? The National Popular Vote Bill would guarantee the presidency to the candidate who receives the most popular votes in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. So how would it work? It would work exactly as it does now. The only difference is that the state would agree to choose the electors who represents the candidate who gets the most votes nationwide, not in their state. So you would have some situations where a state, let's say, voted one way, but it was not consistent with how the national popular vote came out. So that would be a change. And by the way, there are 2 states that don't do it. I said I'd mention that, and that's Maine and Nebraska. And Maine is one of those states that's probably going to move towards national popular vote. They were very shy this past year. I think they were 1 vote short in either their House and their Senate in passing it. Next slide, please. So, but isn't the current way the president and vice president elected required by the Constitution? And let me just say again, all it says in the Constitution is each state, now hit it again, because it'll run. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature may, there it is, may direct a number of electors. That is honestly all it says. Now there's some details here, but that's the key. You get to choose that. And by the way, this was talked about a lot in the last election. Next slide. So what would happen? It would enable all states to be battleground states. Hit it again, please. Respects the right of the state legislators to replace the winner-take-all laws. And it aligns with the Constitution and maintains the integrity of the Electoral College. So how does this happen? It is activated, or activation happens when the signing states have a total of 270 electoral votes, because that's all you need to elect the president. The plan again awards all of the state's electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. Next slide, please. So where are we, you may ask? Where are we? Yes, indeed. So you can see here, all of the green states have already passed national popular vote, which means that they have signed what is called a compact and have agreed that when it is activated, that is that there are 207 states with enough electoral votes, so it adds up to 270, that instead of choosing the electors for the candidate who won in their state, they would choose the electors for the candidate who won nationwide. So to date, if you added all those green states up, there are 196 electoral votes that have already been garnered. 270 are needed, which means that only 74 more electoral votes are needed to activate NPV. So where are we with these other states? So if you look in the little key on the left, you'll see that the orange indicates states that have passed NPV in one legislature. So you can see, for example, I was talking about Maine, and up in Maine, there are 4 votes. They've passed in one legislative session, as has Minnesota, as has Michigan, Arizona, Oklahoma, Arizona, North Carolina. Yellow means that they passed in both states, and that happened this last year in Nevada, where the governor decided not to sign it. And so we expect that they will be back and will pass it again. Blue indicates a hearing by at least one legislative committee, and there are a lot of states where that's happened. And last but not least is where both Florida and South Carolina are. Gray, the bills have been introduced, but there's been no hearing. Next slide. So let me summarize. The National Popular Vote Plan guarantees the candidate with the most popular vote nationwide in all 50 states plus the District of Columbia wins. It gives every vote an equal value. You wouldn't have this discrepancy between Wyoming and Florida, for example. It would ensure that all states are competitive because all of the candidates would have to go to all of the states to find all of the votes. It would reduce voter apathy. It works within the Electoral College, so you don't have to, you preserve tradition, and it wouldn't require a constitutional amendment. Next slide. So where does the League of Women Voters stand? Well, the League of Women Voters was a huge supporter back in 1970 of abolishing the Electoral College. But they have recognized that over the years that as we've gotten, things have gotten a bit more partisan, that the League decided that, and I underline the exact language that the League uses, supports the use of the National Popular Vote Compact as one acceptable way to achieve the goal of the direct popular vote for elections of the president until the abolition of the Electoral College is accomplished. Let me, it also supports uniform voting qualifications and some other things that's also in. And that picture that you see on the bottom is from the convention in Chicago when National Popular Vote was affirmed. Next slide, please. Right, sorry, no, it does not call for the elimination of the Electoral College. Instead, it works within it. And there is a lot of confusion about that. Next slide, please. I just want to mention a few things about Floridians for National Popular Vote. We started with nothing. It was me and a couple of other ladies. We spun off from the League of Women Voters in 2018. We have lots of partners, the League National Popular Vote, Inc., which is an organization in California, which I've encouraged Leslie to get involved with because they have lots and lots of materials. League of Women Voters of Florida, they spun us off, but they are a very close and wonderful partner that we work with. We work with Common Cause of Florida. We work with an Illinois organization called Making Every Vote Matter. And in the last couple of days, we have signed an agreement with a group called Conservatives for Yes on National Popular Vote. We have 20 district chairs throughout Florida who have their own committees who work to communicate about National Popular Vote and also to meet with their own legislators. We have about 50 plus volunteers in addition to the folks we're talking about here. And last but not least, we have a mailing list, which has just grown all by itself. It's really amazing, of over 900. We have our own website, all that sort of stuff. Next slide, please. And what can you all do? Well, the first thing is you can connect with, you know, your South Carolina chair for National Popular Vote. And if you don't have one, you know, do what I did. Just raise your hand and by Jove, it will be all yours. Connect with National Popular Vote. It is a fabulous website. It will tell you more than you ever wanted to know, but it is a huge resource and I recommend it to you. If you want to know what the League is doing, we have our own National Popular Vote Task Force that's been working and has its place on our website, and we have our own PowerPoint, all of which you can use and adapt, all the wonderful things that our National League provides. And then just on a daily basis, you can talk to friends, family, and neighbors. Honest to goodness, most people haven't a clue what this is about, and you'd be surprised how interesting people find it because it's content. You know, people like to learn something new. And as I said earlier, most people were asleep in the 8th grade. You can call into talk shows, ask people about it. And then talk show hosts will begin getting people on who can talk about it. Attend or sponsor speakers at your organizations, churches, schools. We are always being asked for people to come speak. As I say, we have content. It's something new. You can submit letters to the editor. You can submit postcards. You can do all sorts of stuff. You go to political events. You've seen all this stuff. And meet with legislators just to educate them. So I'm going to close here. I think the next slide says thank you. Yes, it does. And below on the bottom, you can see the emails for you to connect with if you want to go further. Leslie, I hand it back to you and look forward to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kathleen. That was a wonderful overview. Loved the graphics, and I thought it was very complementary to what Jordan talked about in the beginning. So I know we have some appendix slides here. I'll skip through these to get to our next segment, but I know we can always come back here during the Q&A.
Yep.
So before we hop to the Q&A, we want to talk a little bit about our call to action. So you'll notice one of the ways that we structured this event is to give the history and then talk about some of the solutions. One of the solutions we've talked about through this series is HR1, the For the People Act. And so just want to continue to update people that that did pass the US House and is now in the US Senate. Of course, it's being filibustered, so an interesting tie into tonight. But absolutely encourage people to reach out to their US senators about that. But for tonight, our call to action is going to be a little different than it has in the past. So in South Carolina, the legislative session is wrapping up in the next couple weeks, and we've already hit the crossover date where bills need to be passed out of one chamber to be considered. There is an MPV bill in South Carolina. That bill was not one that crossed over, and the league does not believe there's a strong chance of that legislation happening in this state, unfortunately. But again, as we said, educating is really important on this. So our call to action to you all this evening is to first and foremost learn more about this. We've put together some great pre-reads for you all, from short articles to podcasts to books, to learn more about the issues we're talking about tonight. So we certainly encourage you to read about them. And then the second one is a little different than our normal call to actions. Instead of calling your state legislators and asking them to pass this bill, we're asking you to ask them their opinion on it. So our hope is that by you all reaching out to them and asking them about the national popular vote, we'll start to educate some folks on what this is and get a sense of their opinions and where they stand. So a little different, but we think equally as important right now. If you are going to get some of these pre-reads, we want to make a quick plug for the League of Women Voters in Hilton Head, who have a discounted online bookshop where the proceeds go back to the league. So these are two of our pre-reads that we've added to the list. And so if you're interested in learning more, just a quick plug for them to check out their online bookstore. But now let's go to our Q&A. So if you have questions, please do submit them to the host in the chat, and we will get to as many as we can. I want to thank Jordan and Kathleen for being quick, because we actually have time for a robust Q&A, which is really exciting. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to get to some of our questions. And I believe we can spotlight Jordan and Kathleen's videos for these. But the first question, we want to go back to the filibuster. So we've talked about the history of the Electoral College and some of the solutions around the national popular vote. We talked about the history of the filibuster. So want to spend a little time in the Q&A talking about some of the solutions or some of the proposed paths forward. The League of Women Voters nationally recently released their position. So it's something we've been long awaiting, and we are very excited to get. And what they said is that the League supports reforming the filibuster to prohibit the minority party from blocking the opening debate of a bill. So the League supports instituting a talking filibuster, ending silent holds, putting the onus on the minority party to produce 40 votes, and lowering the cloture vote threshold to bring bills to a final up or down vote on the Senate floor. So my first question then, based on that intro, is going to be to Dr. Ragusa. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the current status of the filibuster? What's happening right now?
Well, I think that the filibuster is in a precarious position. I may have said this during my remarks, but I think it's a question of when, not if, the filibuster gets jettisoned. And the reason why is that, we see this escalation, this tit for tat that the parties in Congress are constantly engaging in. And from 1917 to 1975, more recently, 2013 and 2017, it feels like the reforms to the filibuster are speeding up very quickly. And I think that Senate Democrats recognize that when they lose the Senate during unified Republican control, provided that the number of Republicans is sufficient to get rid of the filibuster will be gone. More immediately, of course, there's a lot of pressure on Joe Manchin, the Democratic senator from West Virginia, who is the most moderate Senate Democrat, to make some kind of deal to change the filibuster so that some of Joe Biden's agenda can in fact get through. And so, when you talk about HR 1, I think there's tremendous pressure to get HR 1 or some other voting rights legislation passed. It hinges entirely on the filibuster. So the short version is I think that the filibuster's days are numbered. It just hinges on who does it, Republicans or Democrats. We might see some more piecemeal changes. So the talking filibuster is one option. I'm happy to say a little more about the talking filibuster. I'm not totally sure that that's the best idea. Like a lot of things, I think the devil is in the details there. Maybe there are avenues to giving the majority party more bills that it can get through the Senate without a filibuster. There's this kind of quirky set of procedures called reconciliation that allows the majority party two bills that they can get through without the 60 vote threshold. The only stipulations that those have to be related to taxing or spending, which like a lot of things, the devil is in the details. A lot of stuff can be classified as taxing or spending. But there are a range of different options available, from wholesale reform to piecemeal. Wholesale reform is on the horizon. It's a question of when.
Great. And one follow-up question to that then would be, could you lay out some of the arguments that we're hearing in favor of reforming or abolishing the filibuster? And then the other side of that too, the arguments for keeping it as is?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take the second one first. So some of the common arguments for keeping the filibuster. One is that it maintains minority rights and protects the small states against the large states. A second argument is what in the literature we call policy cycling. This is the idea that if you get rid of the filibuster, when parties have unified control of Congress, they're simply going to swiftly undo what the prior majority enacted 2 or 4 years earlier. A third argument is that the filibuster increases deliberation, that it forces members to come together and ultimately pass legislation that's either moderate or better. There's a counter argument to all of those. I mean, on the minority rights, protection of small state things, arguments, we have lots of things that already protect the minority and that protect small states. I mean, the fact that we have separation of powers and checks and balances, the fact that we have a House and a Senate that are very, very different from one another, that are elected differently. That achieves the same goals as ostensibly the filibuster does. We also have federalism. The states retain a tremendous amount of power in our system of government. So does the filibuster protect minority rights and the small states? Sure, but there are also other things that achieve the same. On policy cycling, I wrote a book on repeals. I hope you don't mind me plugging my book. And one of the arguments in that book is that repeals are incredibly difficult to pass. It is simply not the case that if you get rid of the filibuster, the new majority is going to undo dozens of landmark laws that have been acted over, the prior 2 or 3 or 4 decades. Other nations have parliamentary systems with no filibuster, and they don't see this policy cycling that a lot of defenders of the filibuster talk about. Yeah. On deliberation and moderation and producing better legislation, I mean, there's little deliberation in the Senate, even with the filibuster. As I showed in that last chart, the filibuster really is just a tool for the minority to gum up the works. They're not trying to extract concessions. Again, bills that are filibustered end up passing with 95 or even 100 senators in support. So those are some of the common arguments on both sides of the aisle.
Thank you. That was very well summarized. Let's go back to the national popular vote for a minute, and to you, Kathleen. Could you answer a few questions, I guess logistical questions around, is there an estimated time frame for when this would be enacted? Are there certain states that you think are more likely to adopt it next? What's kind of the likelihood of this happening?
Well, if we went back to the map, which I'm familiar with, I don't know if you can bring that back up again. But the states that we think are most likely to drop soon are Virginia, Maine, and Arizona. That's because they almost passed it this year. Maine almost, there we go. You can see it's obviously easier to go to those states where there are already positive efforts have been made. With all due respect, I work hard here in Florida, but I don't have any fantasies that Florida or Texas are going to flip soon, although Texas, I think, might flip a lot sooner than Florida would. But, 74 more electoral votes is not a whole lot. And many of us would like to see if we couldn't get the president elected in 2024. One of the things is that it takes time for change to happen. One of the comments I was going to make about Dr. Ragusa, if you look back at, if you were to ask what was the state that first enabled women to vote, it was in fact Wyoming. And the reason was that they needed more people so that they could have more so that they would actually have enough for for their to be a state. And so it shows you, necessity is often the mother of invention, if you will. And over time, our expectation is that it will change, and that even once it's activated, that the states will eventually roll over. Another example, of course, is the Senate, which I believe it was, I'm going to look to Dr. Ragosa, I think it was 1917, 1918, when they finally passed that that the senators would be elected by direct vote rather than have the state legislatures. So our expectation is that it will eventually happen, because what I didn't do was put up some numbers. Somewhere between 60, depending on whose studies you look at, between 60 and 70% of the US voting population are in favor of national popular vote. And in Florida, we did a survey a couple of years ago. The League did the survey, by the way. We hired Florida Atlantic University's polling center, and it showed that 68% of Floridians wanted to elect the president by popular vote. And that included, we broke it out by, age, sex, geography, and yes, political parties, and something like 54% of Republicans wanted it. So it is an idea whose time I think is going to come. The only question is when.
Great. We've actually had a couple more questions come into the chat around the national popular vote, so I'm going to swap to those. So one question here, and I know we talked about this, but I think it's a really important point, is can you explain, maybe in a sentence or two, either one of you, how a state can be overrepresented if the Electoral College is apportioned by population?
It's because, well, there are probably two reasons. Why don't you give the first one, and then I'll give the leverage issue.
Yeah, the simple answer has to do with the formula for the Electoral College.
Yeah.
Remember, it's number of representatives plus senators, and then the 23rd Amendment gives DC 3. It's the Senate side of things. So Wyoming, the classic example, has 3 electors in the Electoral College. 2 of those just come because of the Senate. So 2/3 of its Electoral College members come from the Senate side of things. California, which is, I think, like 80 times larger than Wyoming, also gets the 2 same senators. So it comes from the Senate. And this is why, even if you adopt reforms that get rid of like the filibuster, even if you get rid of the Electoral College, rural states will still have tremendous power just in the Senate.
Yeah. Well, the second reason is because of the winner take all. And that is because if you win by one vote, you get all of that state's electoral votes. It's not done on any proportional basis, although there are 2 states that have done that. And by the way, that's not a direction you want to move in for a bunch of reasons. That's why Maine's switching, Maine and Nebraska. But, you know, and the reason for that was that Thomas Jefferson wanted to get elected. And he realized that if he got what was called the general ballot in Virginia, that all of the electoral votes would go to him if all he had to do was get one more vote. And he was able to do that. And that's how he became our president.
Kathleen, I'm actually glad you mentioned that, because the next question we had come up was around proportional allocation. So would working toward proportional allocation of states' electoral votes for president be an acceptable alternative to the National Popular Vote Compact?
No, let me explain why. So we have 50 states, right? And if there are problems with the election, each of the 50 states goes ahead and tries to figure out how many, you know, where the problems are, where the flaws were, et cetera. And you all remember 2000 when Florida, in fact, I even live in Palm Beach County, which is where all the hanging chads were located. You don't want to do that. And if you went to proportional, which is what the state, let's say, Maine and Nebraska have done based on the congressional districts, you'd end up with, you know, whatever it is, 482 congressional districts. And you want to have a bigger base, because then you're not going to have as many problems with the numbers. You know, Hillary won by 3 million but still didn't win. 3 million on top of whatever the total is, I forget. Dr. Ragusa may know. What, 100 million people vote? I forget what the total number of voters are. 135 million, I think, is the number. That's much easier than going down into small details and on parts of, you know, cities and towns and all the rest of it. It's really, it would be a nightmare. Do you want to comment? I see you nodding your head there.
Well, I mean, I was going to make sort of a similar point. I mean, I think the National Vote Compact is perfectly fine, and it's something that, you know, personally I'm in favor of. But there is a sort of a far simpler solution that would reduce the rural state bias in the Electoral College and at least move us in the direction of parity. And that is to increase the size of the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
Again, going back to the formula, representatives plus senators, and then 3 for DC. The rural state bias comes from the Senate, but you can dilute the Senate's influence in the Electoral College by just adding more representatives. The nice thing about adding representatives is that it can be done without amending the Constitution. All Congress has to do is pass a law to increase its own size. Congress used to do that very, very regularly. I mean, there was something called the Jefferson rule or the Jefferson ratio. There was 30,000 to 1. And they regularly kept it at 30,000 to 1 throughout the early 1800s. Then it became like 50,000 to 1 once the House got fairly large. Today, it's roughly 700 or 800,000 to 1. So it's 2 to 3 times what it was when the last time that Congress increased its size, which was in 1929. That not only you know, fixes the Electoral College if you think that the Electoral College is broken, and of course that's up for debate. But it has a number of other beneficial features. Remember, representatives are supposed to be tightly connected to their constituents. It's one of the things that differentiates them from senators. If you lower the number of constituents that they have, they can form more meaningful bonds with their citizens. Instead of the 1st Congressional District in South Carolina going all the way down to Hilton Head and like just about all the way up to Myrtle Beach, maybe it's just here in the Charleston area. Also, a member of Congress's key job is constituent service. With fewer constituents, you're better able to serve your constituents. So I'm often talking in favor of increasing the size of the House by like 100 or 200. Of course, that's very political. Everyone knows how that's going to shake out, and so it's problematic. It would be filibustered.
I would, of course, respond. We got 196 electoral votes. We only need 74 more. And I'm hoping we get there in the next couple of years. And while there is an argument for yours, I think it's got a long way to go.
Well, this is great because one of our goals for tonight was to discuss multiple solutions and options. And one I'd like to spend a little more time discussing is a nationwide constitutional convention. This is something that the league is opposed to, and there are definitely some downfalls there. Jordan and Kathleen, feel free. Do you guys mind just talking a little bit about some of the risks that a constitutional convention would bring?
Yeah, you know, I'm going to move ahead here because one of the things that the league has been very involved with, as you all know, is putting out the voter guide. And we've spent a lot of time in Florida. One of my favorite things that I like to do is talk about the Constitution of the United States, which is about this big. And then I bring out the Constitution of Florida, which is huge. It's got more stuff in it than you would ever want. And I am, and we are very much in favor of less being done in constitutions because it's very hard to get rid of it. And it really depends on who gets appointed to the Constitutional Convention, who's the governor, who's the senator, all that sort of stuff. And it is a nightmare. It is much better, at least in our league's opinion, to if you've got to make a change, then pass a bill, for goodness sakes. You don't need to put it into the Constitution because it is so difficult to change once it's there. And I'll tell you, it's much better to have a Constitution that is this size as opposed to a Constitution that is this size. And every time you have a new party, they change it, they do this, they do that. It is a nightmare. I don't know if that's true in South Carolina. I'll defer to you, Professor.
I don't have a ton to add. I agree. I think a national convention or a so-called Article 5 convention is an unwise idea. It's one of these things where you get a lot of liberal groups that are supporting it, chiefly because they want to overturn Citizens United. You get a lot of conservative groups that aren't in favor because they think they're going to get a balanced budget amendment added to the Constitution. But these are narrow interests that have only that one thing in mind.
Yeah.
The problem is that in a Article 5 convention, it's unprecedented. There are no rules. Congress would not supervise this convention. The Supreme Court would have no jurisdiction over this convention. So we don't know who's setting the agenda, how the delegates are going to be allocated, and what the voting rules are. Of course, one of the really thorny problems is that the small states would occupy a big majority of states. So one logical argument is, well, just like in the regular Constitutional Convention, states get one vote per state. You know, you have a delegation of 5 or 7, some odd number. And if 3 of the 5 members vote for some amendment, well, then that state votes for it. Well, 26 states represents something like maybe 20% of the US population. So a majority of states represented by 20% of the population could dictate everything that happens in the convention. And that's really problematic to me in the times that we're currently in. I think in an era where the temperature was a bit lower, maybe then it wouldn't be such a bad idea. But I worry about all kinds of problematic things added to a new constitution or taken out. I mean, one that really scares me is getting rid of birthright citizenship, something that was added to the 14th Amendment, given the Dred Scott decision. I don't want the federal government in the business of saying, you're no longer a citizen and therefore you don't enjoy the protections afforded under the Constitution. That's what happened in the past. And so I'm not in favor of an Article 5 convention. I think it is a really, really bad idea.
Great, thank you. Those are wonderful answers. We have time for about one more question, and I want to grab that one from the chat. It's going back to the national popular vote, and this is interesting. It says it seems like national popular vote creates spectator states or regions where candidates would campaign in the most populous areas, for example, while leaving out non-populous areas. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, can you bring my slides up, because I've got a slide on this.
Yes.
And then go way to the end. Keep going. Let's see, withdrawing, keep going. Wait, you went too quickly. Yeah, that's the slide right there. So a lot of people say, well, why don't people just go to California, right? California has 37 million people, and I forget what their voting is, but let's say it's 20 million people vote. I don't know exactly what it is. But take a look at all of the small states. You can't win with only 37 million. You've got to go find the rest of the population. There's another slide too, I think. Keep going. It shows the big cities versus small. Keep going. Well, there's another one. That's another one. If you looked at all the small states, keep going. I think there's another one. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Well, maybe it's not in here. All right, never mind. The answer is that if you look, the 100 largest cities in the United States equal about a third of the population. If you look at all of the rural states, it's about a third of the population, which means where's the other third of that population? And they are in the suburbs. So you really can't just go to one, to Chicago or Los Angeles or, the big cities and think you're going to be able to do it. You've got to go look for every vote. I attended about a year and a half ago, when we were still going places, a fascinating event where a bunch of very smart people were brought together to say, how would campaigns change if national popular vote were passed? And the bottom line on it is that it would change it dramatically, because candidates would really have to campaign everywhere, because every vote would become valuable. Does that answer the question?
Yes, that was great. Thank you. All right, well, we're almost at time. Just to close out, if there are any last words you all would like to leave us with, whether it's a summary of what folks should say to their legislators or anything for us to keep in mind, would love to close out with just some final thoughts from you two.
I have a thought. There's a lot of similarities between South Carolina and Florida in terms of our legislatures. And a lot of the legislators who we've talked to have said, oh, it's never going to happen. I don't need to learn about it. And in fact, one of the things that has caught their attention is that, it doesn't need to pass in Florida or in South Carolina. This thing could get passed in a lot of other states and they'd be on the sidelines watching. And so they really ought to learn a little bit about it, because they ought to know what goes on. And it is so confusing. Most people think national popular vote means that the Electoral College would be eliminated, and you can't do that. So education, listen to what they have to say. Education is really, in our opinion, the direction to move.
I was going to give a totally different answer until you mentioned education. As an educator, I happen to think that education is very important. And one of the things that makes me very hopeful for the future are my students. My students care deeply about the issues. I think that they realize that the world they're about to inherit is not the world that their parents inherited. And I think they have an activist streak in them that my generation never had. And if you look at the data, baby boomers are no longer the largest voting bloc in this country. It's millennials and the generation right behind them. So I think we've got a lot of challenges in this country. Democracy is certainly on the ropes, but young people give me a lot of hope.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, to close us out, just want to give one final reminder about our fourth event in the series, Money in Politics, which will be Monday, May 10th. So please mark your calendars, check us out online, and sign up for the newsletter. And Just one more huge thank you to Dr. Ragusa and Kathleen for joining us tonight. This was a wonderful conversation. I know I learned a lot. So thank you so much for giving up your Monday night when it's 70 degrees outside to be with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie.